Hello, I'm Dr. Kelman Andrassy, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about research ethics. Science is able to lead us to a lot of very interesting discoveries and helps us to improve the lives of people around us. But that being said, it's not really an anything goes kind of an endeavor, right? There are a number of really important professional expectations uh, that really come out of a very unfortunate history of very outrageous human subject research and experimentation over the years. And it really all stems from the end of World War II and the beginning of the Nuremberg trials, in which American judges were ultimately put to the task of determining whether or not Nazi scientists in Germany engaged in war crimes by doing some pretty horrendous things in the name of scientific research. And ultimately, the Nuremberg trials led to the establishment of really the first major code of ethics with regard to engaging in any type of research study, known as the Nuremberg Code. Okay. Now, to sort of parallel this, the Nazis weren't the only researchers capable of committing significant atrocities and, in general, behaving unethically in the conduct of their um, studies. The United States is no different, and you have the Tuskegee syphilis study, which basically individuals were intentionally denied treatment for syphilis. And the point was to observe the progression of the disease, particularly in African American males. So there had been a lot of research and data available for Caucasian uh, subjects as well as Asian subjects from studies that were done in places like China and Japan. But very little information was made available about African American males, and in fact, the hypothesis at the time was that African Americans and really any race in particular or ethnicity would be affected differently by different diseases, thinking that the genetic makeup was sufficiently different enough that there would be different results based on the types of diseases that individuals would get. So essentially, with the Tuskegee syphilis study, individuals were allowed to progress in the disease all the way up until death. The study was not deemed to be over for a participant until they actually died. And of course, after that, the United States specific Belmont Report in 1979 was established as a code of conduct relevant to anybody who engaged in scientific research in the United States. And the Office of Human Research Protections was established as well to sort of oversee research. So when we talk about ethics, what is it that we're actually talking about? So a lot of people associate the concept of ethics with a very, very similar concept that is morality or morals. Okay? Now, the main distinction between morals and ethics are that morals are sort of these societally based codes of conduct that allow you to determine right versus wrong. Ethics, on the other hand, are those principles or values or even professional standards that are considered acceptable and appropriate based on some sort of a role that an individual takes on. So you can kind of liken it to the concept of duty, right? If you are a medical doctor, for example, you have a completely different set of duties and ethics than somebody who is not a medical doctor, right? You have to take you have to take certain oaths in order to be able to practice medicine, chief among them being not to do harm to any patient. Similarly, if you are an attorney, you are held to a different standard than just a normal civilian with regard to how you conduct your matters in a court of law, right? You're not allowed to reveal confidential information about your clients, for example. And you also have to act in your client's best interest, even if you know deep down in your heart that they are in fact guilty of any crime that they may have committed. Okay? If you are a personal financial advisor and you have a fiduciary duty, you have certain ethical principles that you have to adhere to that look after the financial security of the individuals you represent rather than your own. So basically, when we talk about ethics, they are the prohibitions against and prescriptions for specific kinds of behavior. And in research, we have our own pretty comprehensive set of ethics that we have to follow. Okay? Now, the two big organizations that are responsible for determining what the ethics are of a professional body in research are the first American Psychological Association, which is considered sort of the granddaddy of all the social science research associations. It's really the big guns, the heavy hitter, the one that's been around for a pretty extensive period of time. And then we also have the American Sociological Association, if you're going to be talking about sociological research, which is a bit smaller, but is, the group that's ultimately responsible for specifically dealing with issues as far as social scientific research at the group level. Okay? So basically, the main principles that are established in research based on the APA and the ASA are sort of multifold, and you have to kind of be able to look at each of the particular values that are promoted by looking at kind of their subdivisions and what goes into the specific code or specific value that's being addressed. So first and foremost, professional competence is one of the main requirements for research. The idea there, of course, is that you have to be trained in whatever it is that you're doing your research about, right? If you're going to be doing medical research, not everybody is able to do medical research. You have to have sufficient training in biology or physiology, or you're a medical doctor or something along those lines in order to be deemed professionally competent to do that sort of research, right? If you're engaging in psychological research, you're probably going to need some extensive training as to what is acceptable and not acceptable as far as psychological research is concerned. Next, you have the notion of integrity, and that comes about because of numerous cases in which individuals pretty much made up their data and came to conclusions that were not supported by the data that they had collected. And very notably, in relatively recent history, was a study on vaccines and their correlation with autism, which later the researcher indicated that he basically did not have integrity and made up all the data, subsequently lost their position, and I believe was stripped of their doctoral degree as a result. Okay? Third code in the Code of Ethics are professional and scientific responsibility, and that is essentially all about making sure that you are engaging in practices that are consistent with the profession or the scientific field that you are doing your research on. Number 4, you have to respect people's rights, their dignity, and their diversity in conducting your research. You can't single out individuals or leave out individuals on the basis of any demographic characteristic, except in cases where you're specifically looking at whether there are any characteristics different for individuals of certain demographics. Like, you can't intentionally leave out African American individuals from a particular study just because, unless it is that you're specifically looking at how non-African Americans respond to a particular social situation or something like that. The last code there is social responsibility as well. You have to make sure that your research does not have a negative impact on broader society in engaging in your research. Okay? So in order to ensure that these sorts of ethical principles are being followed at the university level and also in certain types of professional organizations as well, you have institutional review boards, also known as the IRB, that are basically a committee that exists to evaluate proposed research to determine if it meets the ethical standards established under the various codes that are out there for conducting research. Okay, so these IRBs, they're generally going to be providing ethics training to individuals that might be engaged in research. Cal State Long Beach is no exception, but really any university, University of Alabama at Birmingham, where also I teach, all have IRBs, and all of them have certification training programs that attempt to minimize the opportunities for individuals to engage in unethical research. So they provide that training, but they also review and evaluate research studies and inform researchers basically of how their projects and studies might potentially violate some of the principles of ethical research. Okay? Which leads us to the core principles of ethical research that you have to kind of keep in mind that are, really stringently followed by institutional review boards or IRBs. Okay? The first core principle is, of course, to do no harm, and that comes initially from the oaths that medical professionals have to take. The idea that one is not to intentionally harm individuals in the process of gathering data for research. Now, of course, there are instances where perhaps individuals would potentially be hurt by some sort of an experiment. I mean, if you give somebody an injection, for example, right? It can be painful in certain circumstances. It does pierce the skin, it does cause a little bit of hurt, but it doesn't cause any long-term lasting damage, right? And perhaps there are other therapies and treatments, like electroshock therapies, especially for more chiropractic and muscle-related remedies and whatnot to help with pain and things like that. The initial shock or something could potentially hurt somebody, but before an IRB will approve any research that involves that sort of thing, you have to basically show that no long-lasting harm is going to be had as a result. Okay? The second main principle of research is the concept of voluntary participation. So, of course, first and foremost, don't hurt anybody, don't harm anybody. But second, make sure that if they are going to participate, they do so of their own volition. One cannot be compelled or forced to engage in research. And that's really part of the reason why I would strongly advise academics to try to refrain from doing any research that involves children or individuals that are in prison. Why? Because the notion of voluntary participation with regard to children is that, as minors, they don't have the right of consent. A contract is not legally binding on an individual that is under the age of 18, for example. So one cannot be expected to ensure that children participate voluntarily in research studies. So you'll have to jump through hoops in order to get a study approved through the IRB that does work with children. And of course the same for prisoners who have essentially been stripped of their rights and must basically do what the warden and the prison guards tell them to do. So there's no guarantee that they are participating voluntarily. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be working with these individuals, that you really follow the very stringent rules that I'm sure the IRB will be putting upon you in order to get that sort of study approved. The next core principle is informed consent, which is a big topic of discussion, especially when engaging in things like survey research and any type of face-to-face research as well, where you have to inform individuals of every aspect of the research study and inform them of any potential for harm or the benefits associated with the study, so that they know and they're able to weigh the cost-benefit analysis of whether or not they should participate in the study. Privacy is another major component of conducting research, and of course privacy is all about ensuring either the anonymity or the confidentiality of your clients, or rather I should say the research subjects, as you collect your data and report that data, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And then last but not least, in line with that concept of social responsibility and professional and scientific responsibility and integrity from the professional standards for ethics, comes the notion or core principle of honest reporting. Don't make up your data, don't steal other people's data. Things like that. Those will get you into big trouble if you do engage in those sorts of things. So basically you have to try to first and foremost minimize any harm that could potentially come to your respondents, and that includes physical harm, psychological harm, emotional harm, social harm, if anything could potentially affect one's relationships with other people. Financial harm, if you could lose money as a result of the things that the data that's essentially collected. And then of course legal harm, if anybody could potentially be in trouble as a result of participating in the study with the law. Okay, so there's a lot of different cases out there that could point to each of these different things. We're going to talk about the Stanley Milgram experiments with regard to the more psychological and potentially emotional harm that could be associated with the study. Physically, of course, we have the Tuskegee study, if that wasn't clear enough already. Social harms, anything where you're doing research and a person could lose, friends or get into unfortunate situations with their family. So if you're doing research on infidelity, for example, or anything like that, you're not allowed to reveal the identities of the individuals, for example, that participate in that study, because it could lead to negative social ramifications. Legally, lots of different studies where researchers collected data on individuals and then police came knocking trying to get that information. So if you're doing research on gang members or something like that, or organized crime, or any sort of different thing. There was a very famous study in Texas where a researcher looked at homosexual sexual relations, particularly in public places. And at the time, before, I believe it was Lawrence versus Texas was the Supreme Court case that overturned the legislation, it was illegal to engage in acts of sodomy in the state of Texas. And the researcher was actually arrested, and fortunately wasn't charged and wasn't taken to prison or anything like that. But still, very, very sticky situation there for that researcher, where they were essentially being asked to legally harm their research participants by the police. Okay? So ultimately, the big problem with any type of research is that it's completely impossible to 100% guarantee that no harm will come to any of the participants, right? So that's why the notion of voluntary participation and in turn informed consent are of such quintessential importance, right? Individuals have to be made aware of the circumstances surrounding the study, and they are to participate of their own volition, right? No one is required to participate in any research that they're uncomfortable with, and they have to be advised of the details of the study and be formally asked to participate before they are allowed to begin their participation. And we're going to go into the 5 parts of informed consent shortly, but first let's discuss anonymity and confidentiality, and then of course honest reporting as well. So anonymity is slightly different from confidentiality. Anonymity is when you as the researcher do not know who the participant is. So anytime that you have more of a blind questionnaire going out, let's say you post a survey questionnaire on social media, for example, or a discussion forum or something along those lines. You don't necessarily know who is going to be responding to that particular survey. In that case, you can potentially guarantee the anonymity of those individuals if you are not obtaining any type of descriptive characteristics of the participants of the study. So anonymity is only ensured when nobody, including yourself as the researcher, knows who is actually participating. But most studies, I would argue, are a matter of confidentiality. So in those cases, you are aware of the identity of the potential participants. But the only difference there is that no third party is made aware. Nobody other than yourself is to know who the participant is in your research. So one of those two is likely to be required if you are conducting research, or at least guaranteed to the individuals participating in your study. Now, there are certain circumstances in which you can stop maintaining the confidentiality of your participants, and that is when the participants in your research state unequivocally that they want their information to be revealed. So let's say you're doing research, interview research with professionals in the field, and the individual wants their name associated with what they just talked to you about, right? Only under those sorts of circumstances can you lift the confidentiality requirement. But under all other circumstances, you want to make sure that there's no identifying information in the data collection process. So you don't use names. You talk about people as respondent 1, respondent 2. In the case of doing quantitative research, for example, the simple fact that you're putting your data in coded fashion into some sort of data analysis software package, for example, that usually is enough to ensure that the individuals their confidentiality is maintained, provided you delete the names of individuals and any other identifying characteristics. I mean, demographic characteristics are fine. Identifying if somebody is of a particular age or a particular ethnicity, so long as the data is not immediately linked to their identifiable information. Okay? And then last but not least, as far as this is concerned, honest reporting. It's the general notion that, you have to report data and its analysis in an accurate and an ethical way. So things like plagiarism, which I've talked about before, fabricating data, intentionally misinterpreting the results of research, that can lead to very serious repercussions. So all research has to be done in good faith. Yeah, there have been unfortunate instances in which individuals did act unethically, either engaging in acts of plagiarism or misinterpreting information, and it gets cost them dearly, right? I mentioned in the database search video and citation information about Paul Schmidt, who was the former president of Hungary, who was stripped of his PhD, and ultimately had to sort of resign from engaging in unethical research practices, right? So in general, when we're talking about informed consent and voluntary participation, the way we kind of deal with that most of the time in research is by putting together a form that individuals will ultimately sign off on that informs the individual that's going to participate, the respondent, what the details of the study are. And that ultimately breaks down to 5 major components as far as informed consent is concerned. Number 1 being you have to reveal what the purpose of the study is. So you're going to go out there and say, hey, this study is about finding data about X, Y, and Z, and it'll be used to do A, B, and C, right? Next are the procedures. Ultimately, what will be done during the course of the participation in the study. So if you're doing a survey, that's going to be easy enough. There are 10 questions about X, Y, and Z. Some of these are demographic questions. Others are questions pertaining to the variables in question. There will be a 60-minute time limit to participating in the study, et cetera, et cetera. If you're doing more face-to-face sort of research, observational studies or interviews or things like that, you have to go into additional detail about what sorts of specific data are going to be recorded, since it might not necessarily be as straightforward as the set closed-ended questions on certain types of study questionnaires. Okay. Next, you have to discuss the potential benefits associated with the study. And it can be as simple as, this will contribute to our knowledge of the social and scientific world. Or, you can have more specific benefits associated with it. You could be talking about in terms of applied research. This will be used to help inform the decision-making process in putting together a new policy for Organization X. But other benefits include any type of enticements that you might be giving to participate in the study. For example, if you give out gift cards or anything like that to motivate individuals to participate in a study, you're going to want to list that information as well. Next, very important, listing out the potential harms of the study. And, I would say that for most studies, there are no immediate threats to the harm that could potentially be done to individuals. For the most part, you're going to say for most survey questionnaires, for example, that there are no immediate risks associated with participating in this study. But I would always include the phrase along the lines of, but if you feel like any of these questions could potentially cause harm to your physical, emotional, psychological, financial, or legal situation, feel free not to answer them. I always include that language just in case something pops up that was unexpected and out of the ordinary that could result in the harm of individuals. And of course, last but not least, and also very, very important, a participant has to be aware that they are able to withdraw from the study. But not just that, they have to be aware that they can withdraw from the study literally at any time. They can be on the last question, the last word of that last question, and still withdraw from the study. And they can do so for any reason that they want. It can even be, I don't feel like taking this anymore, or, I have to go feed the dog, right? Without penalty. So there can be no penalty associated with withdrawing from the study. You cannot compel an individual to remain in a study for any reason, okay? And that's usually going to be the first page of a research questionnaire, a survey questionnaire, to have an informed consent form. With an interview or other type of more qualitative research, you might also have a similar form as well. Okay? But in addition to that, especially with a survey questionnaire, you might also want to have some sort of a debriefing form, or sometimes in terms of qualitative research, it can be a verbal debriefing, or it can be written down in a form as well, just like you would your voluntary participation form. But with a debriefing, you're essentially going in and you're kind of going over all the information of what was just discussed and what's going to be done with it. And once again, you're trying to reassure individuals that their information isn't going to be nefariously used or anything like that. So basically what you're going to do is start by restating the purpose of the study, just like you did in the first part of the informed consent form. You want to tell individuals what the ultimate purpose is of the study that they had just participated in. Okay. Second, you want to sort of reassert that the participant's identity is going to be kept private and confidential, right? Just because the informed consent form itself, I didn't go over those, other aspects like maintaining the privacy of individuals. It still is important to ensure that individuals are made aware of the fact that their information is not going to be revealed as a result of participating in the study. And so, you might want to throw that in your informed consent page, say it to them verbally if you're going to be conducting more face-to-face research, but you do want to let them know that their information will be private and confidential, and of course you want to restate that in the debriefing section as well. Finally, you want to provide individuals with your contact information. So that if they have any questions or comments or concerns, they have a place to turn to. And also if they want to get a copy of the research report, right? People are entitled to the information in your research report if they gave their information to you, right? So that's basically what we're kind of going to be focusing on as far as research ethics are going to be concerned. In a future video, I'm going to be doing basically setting up a research study in terms of a survey questionnaire that is going to include both an informed consent page, the research questions, and a debriefing section at the end. All that is to make sure that the research is being conducted in as ethical a manner as possible. And those are the kinds of things that an institutional review board is going to be looking for in analyzing the extent to which ethical principles were ultimately followed.